Good to see you.
All right.
Awesome. So good evening, everyone. So we have a very exciting session lined up today with Rishi. So Rishi is a very interesting chap. He has been working with CyberRock, and he recently released a Notion document. Thanks for that. I think it consists of very valuable information. Great job there.
Awesome.
So Rishi will be talking today about. I'll set the context, and we will do intros, and we will deep dive into the discussion. So for people who are looking to get into Web3, most of the folks think the entry point to Web3 is only through technical stuff, whether it is Solidity, Ethereum, and there is like a lot of intimidating factor, unfortunately, for like, a lot of folks. So this session is primarily geared towards demystifying those myths, especially. So Rishi will be walking us through what are the opportunities in the non-tech world, especially in the Web3 world, with regards to community, with regards to there are a bunch of stuff, growth aspects, managing your discords, etc., and all that. So that's sort of the context for this session. On that note, my name is Kiran. Most of you might know me, but if not, like I'm the co-founder of Web3 Learn, a blockchain skilling platform. We do roll out like a lot of skilling around blockchain space, both tech and non-tech. Please do check out our website and join our Discord to learn with developers. So I'll, more than me introducing, I'll let Rishi introduce himself and his background, and we'll kickstart the conversation from there. Rishi, over to you.
Awesome. Great. Happy to be here. Glad we got on that call. What was it, like 2 weeks ago now? Yeah, and just generally excited about people getting curious about Web3 because to give you some context, I currently lead growth at a hardware wallet company called CyberRock. And what CyberRock is essentially is the world's first hardware wallet that doesn't require you to have a seed phrase backup. And I'll go into what that sort of means in a little bit. But to set some context, right? Like I personally got into crypto around like 2017, 2018 when I was in college. It was like we luckily had a course designed at the time, which talked about learning about blockchain through the lens of Bitcoin, right? So some of the things that obviously what takeaways was obviously the tech is sort of revolutionary in the sense of like being completely sort of trustless and replacing trust with proof, right? So that naturally had big implications. But what really got me excited was the absolute audacity of the technology to take on how we sort of even visualize society today, right? Whether that be in our governance systems, whether that be how we run our companies, how we run our government, how we run our day-to-day interactions with each other. So that's really what got me excited, right? I think what a good entry point to that was sort of identity as a whole, right? Like, and how do we sort of identify with each other, on the blockchain? And that's not like in some vague sense, but in the sense of like, how do I prove to other people that I'm Rishi and I own this laptop, or I own this property, or I have XYZ, family members, or, just generally things like that. So identity becomes really, really important because essentially everything that we consider ourselves like right now is given to you, is sort of essentially handed down from like a centralized, entity, right? Which is the government, right? And we have, it was a crazy concept, but like we have seen sort of governments essentially failing, right? Like we've seen lots of issues with at the time when I was sort of getting the blockchain with Syria, sort of Sri Lanka is going through its own crisis at the moment. Like Greece, I think, happened at the same time where there's just all sorts of issues. But that was like sort of I digress. That was sort of like an interest for me. So fast forward, working at CyberRock, we what we're trying to achieve is really simplifying the wallet ecosystem, right? For anyone coming into blockchain, into sort of the Web3 world, the first thing you're going to interact with is a wallet of some sort, right? Like whether that be, you buy and sell crypto on an exchange, or someone gives you money into your wallet, like ideally, like that's the first interactional layer. Surprisingly, that's the layer that's the least bothered about, right? Like that's the layer with the most vulnerabilities and it's least thought about, right? Like where NFTs became a huge craze, and there's no way of sort of demystify like what the code base does. What will happen if there's this one command? What happens to the marketplace if like their vulnerabilities get exploited and your wallets are connected to it, right? So we're learning sort of the hard way, which is sort of painful, but that's just how we, I think, as a species are with generally everything, right? So we sort of tend to learn the hard way. So what Cypherhawk is really doing is that, it's removing one critical pain point in the wallet ecosystem, right? Like for anyone that has any sort of cryptocurrencies not on an exchange currently, you're probably using a service like MetaMask, or if you have a hardware wallet, it's most likely a Ledger or a Trezor. Great products. Only problem is that they all sort of contain this thing called a seed phrase, right? Seed phrases are essentially like your access to whatever is stored on that wallet, right? Whether that be Bitcoin, Ethereum, Solana, Avalanche, whatever you have on that wallet. It's 12, 18, or 24 random words that are going to reconstruct your whole wallet to anyone who has access to that, right? So if like, my 24 words are given to, let's say, Kiran, he can, without my permission, access all my crypto, drain it out to a different wallet, right? So what our wallet does is essentially like at the time of onboarding, right? Like when you generate a wallet on Cypherhawk, your seed phrase is distributed, right? Like your seed phrase is like sort of split amongst 4 cards and 1 device, right? In the sense that you never have to write down your seed phrase anywhere. You never have to expose it to anyone. It's sort of distributed within these card systems, and to make a transaction or to have a signature, you just tap your card onto the device and you're good to go. And ideally we use like a 2 out of 5 scheme, right? Like there's 5 components of the device where you don't need all the cards or all the device to be in the same place. What that basically means is that it's simplifying the process of securing your cryptocurrencies, right? Like you don't have to worry about each component all the time. So that I think is like a really big shift from a wallet standpoint, and making onboarding sort of easier, right? Like if you don't have to worry about it, like it makes like the process a lot simpler, sort of moving forward. So yeah, that's a little bit of background on what got me into Web3, and a little bit about what Cypherhawk does.
Cool. Super awesome. So before diving into the various aspects where people can start building careers in the Web3. So how did your journey into growth happen? And like what did you have any specific background, and especially why did you choose growth as a vertical in the Web3 space, and like what excites you on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. Really good question. So we'll again probably trace back to like sort of college beginnings, right? Like where so I was really fortunate in the sense that I was thrown into a really vibrant startup ecosystem, right? And at the time that was Los Angeles, right? So a lot of things were coming up. And my university just generally had a lot of kids like talking about this thing called a startup, right? Like I had no clue coming in because I was in a boarding school, like in the middle of a hill. So for me, like big companies made sense, right? Like, I mean, you've heard of Google, you've heard of Facebook. Startups, wala, no clue, right? Like, kya hai ye? Like, how is it going to work? Like, I had no idea. But there was just so much talk about it, right? And I noticed that like most of this, like all the smart kids that I would consider smart in my class, like they're working on something or the other on the side, and they're trying to, build something. And I was like, cool, like, let me get involved. So, got involved with various organizations. One that really pushed me over the edge was this venture fund called Contrary Capital, right? So this venture fund was really, really interesting in the sense that they took college students, right? And they made them venture scouts, right? Like you were able to write like a check, given the rest of, you have to sort of bring in deals to the fund. And then, as a fund, you decide that you can write checks all the way up to $500,000 into companies, right? That's real money, right? Like that's real money. So the stakes were pretty high. Quality had to be really high. And you just like, you had to learn, right? Like you had to learn really quickly about different things. So I really got interested in like sort of the venture building side of things, right? Like how do you go from like idea generation to actually feasibility analysis, right? Testing out the idea ki, acha ye karne se yahan par waisa hota hai, like this happens with someone else, like, and then eventually seeing, like then gauging sort of like that people are willingness to pay, or like sort of like appetite to pay. And that's when you sort of like consider business models, and then you build across your design language. So it's like a sort of step-by-step process. That process really interested me, right? Like and it was like purely a venture builder sort of like, it was for me, it was like an interesting way to see an idea become into a company. right? So early stage really interested me because you get to go from idea generation to like initial sort of business model. Fast forward coming out of college, post graduation, I came back to India. Obviously, COVID was a very major contributing factor, and also like, startups are sort of like how sort of immigration is and things like that. It's difficult for if you're like a startup inclined person, like for you to get visa and all that stuff. But I was lucky enough to come back to India, get involved with startups in general, and came across another organization called GrowthX. That was like, so Growth I'd heard of before because of this guy Andrew Chen, right? And he's not just some guy, like he's the growth guy who sort of helped with Uber, joined Andreessen Horowitz, like really like sort of accumulated, like sorry, not even accumulated, but like assimilated this idea of like growth as a process, right? You can do experiments and then sort of reap results, right? If you change design language a certain way, if you change sort of pricing a certain way, you're going to get certain outputs, right? So I got interested from Andrew Chen's side, and then I realized that growth lies at the center of little bits of product, little bits of marketing, little bits of sale. It's like it gives you like a cross-functional idea, but at the same time, like you have to make sense because you're now responsible for a company moving forward, right? So that's sort of like for a generally curious person, like it was really great. And then going through GrowthX, like GrowthX was like an eight-week accelerator program, where they really like they did a fantastic job of like distilling growth into like 4 subsections, right? All the way from like how you acquire users, how you engage them on like the onboarding process, monetization, all of these sort of different ideas that came together. Basically to itch my like want to be able to build companies, like I sort of found growth to be like the perfect way to be curious while testing out different hypotheses and then sort of see what you get out from it.
Cool. Awesome. So for those of you guys, I think Rishi mentioned 2 interesting terms there. So Venture Scout and Anderson, right? Anderson is the name. So Venture Scout is someone who actually, all the VC firms have to source deals, right? So generally the sourcing happens through 2 ways. One is inbound and one is outbound. Inbound is, say if you're a founder and if you're a startup, you are writing to Sequoia and Lightspeed, okay, hey, this is what I'm building, here is my pitch deck, please start looking into that. I'm happy to have a conversation. And outbound is where the VC firms reach out to the founders and the startups saying that, okay, hey, I think I would love to listen to you on what the interesting stuff that you're building. So venture scouts are a conduit between the VC firm and the startups. So the venture scouts actually understand the investment thesis of the VC firm, and they go around and find those interesting startups and companies. So Rishi played that important, great role, in the Silicon Valley. So I think we should do some session or some notes there. Yeah,
they did me. It was more of a favor because I got to learn like 10x, right? Like I was just thrown to learn. It was perfect. Like for like a 19-20-year-old kid, right? Like you're getting to see, you get the credibility, right? You get the credibility to actually have a conversation. Ki log tumhe seriously lenge, right?
Yes.
That's the number one thing. Like people need to take you seriously. Then you sort of get to like build all this gyan, right? Because your job as a VC or when VCs are like, if they're doing most of the talking, like you're in the wrong room, right? So I just got to sit there and absorb, right? Like, and smart founders, right? Like really smart guys that, like honestly, like it was like a lot of thousands of dollars worth of learning I was getting for free, right? Like, so I took it. So I really was able to capitalize on that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Sam Altman, the president of YC, was at one point of time also a venture scout, by the way.
Yep.
So
yep.
That's super awesome. So and those of you again here, if you don't know Andrew Chen, I highly recommend, this is not a promotion, by the way, FYI. So highly recommend, reading his book, The Cold Start Problem. I think I read that like what, 5 or, close to 8 or 10 times, in the last 6 months.
It's a textbook.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It's actually textbook. Like if you're working on any sort of like company building aspects, like you don't read it because you're going to read it, right? Like you're reading it like as a reference point. Like, okay, I'm working on a campaign. You open this book and then you're like, okay, page 30 as XYZ, right? So it's literally like that.
I mean, the component of the growth stories are there, if you are
Totally.
really working in the growth, yeah, just you should really go invest money and read that book. Okay. On that note, Rishi, this is getting very super interesting. So
Yeah.
when you look at growth, you were part of growth. I'm 100% sure you worked on some case studies with regards to the Web2 companies, right? And now you are at a very interesting junction with Cyprock, which is more of a Web3 company, hardware, wallet,
So, so
So how do you draw parallels, from the growth aspect? Like, how does the growth aspect in a Web2 differ to vis-a-vis Web3?
yeah.
Because the stakeholders and the users in both these verticals are totally different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So how do you draw parallels, and are there any specific set of skill sets that you require if you are looking to work in
Right.
growth in Web3? And also, I would also like to understand what is the sort of mindset, right? And I think it's all about the mindset. There is set of a thesis, there is set of templates, and the set of the processes that you can define. But like, what is that mindset change that we, first of all, do you need to have a mindset change? If so, what sort of mindset change that you need to have from Web2 to Web3?
Yeah, absolutely. Great. I mean, nice and loaded question. So I'm going to break that down. So I think number one is drawing parallels, right? So building a web, and I can only talk from like early stage starters perspective, because that's what I have. I'm not going to comment on scale and things like that, right? So that's maybe for another time. So when you, in terms of trying to draw parallels from a growth perspective, right? Like, I think the number one thing that we sort of did was like really focusing on like, who cares about your product. That's really number one, right? Like, and it's not going to matter. You could be selling like a paperclip, right, to all the way, like, like a protocol. Who is going to care, right? Finding who's going to care is, like, I think, one of the hardest problems, right? So when you do find who's going to care, right, like, what are their sort of core issues, right? Like, what are some core problems? So we take the example of, like, we take Cyprock's example, right? Like, who cares about this product? Obviously, like, people within crypto wanting to be a part of the crypto ecosystem, will tend to have an X amount of dollars invested in crypto, are semi-knowledgeable but aren't sort of like super technical, right? But the whole idea is that you drill down into what this persona looks like, right? And that goes the same across, like, every, like, you can draw parallel to any sort of organization. Then comes the step of actually, like, what, and obviously the next step would be like sort of what they want and what the problem is. Third is, how do you articulate the solution, right? So sometimes, when we encounter a problem, like, it's ideally like, and we come up with like an instant solution which is may not work, right? Like, you may strike gold and you may sort of do well, but you have to sort of come up with a solution that's loaded, right? Like, that solves a core problem that can be built upon. And the reason why I say solves a core problem that can be built upon is because as a company, you can't live on just like moral support, right? You have to be able to figure out some way to, okay, if you have to figure out a solution that, oh my god, I want to pay for this, right? It is such a great solution that I am going to give you XYZ money and you go do it for me, right? Then comes the interesting problem of how much money are you willing to pay me, right? But then you have this narrow demographic, right? Like, people who are interested in my product, that care about me, that give a damn of what I'm trying to do, and will give me money to do it. Fantastic. Now all you have to do is go find more people, right? So it's that same process that goes across Web2 to Web3, right? And this is a gross oversimplification, right? Like, obviously there's, like, multiple steps in between where you sort of test ideas and things like that. But I think, like, sort of the greatest parallel is drawing, like, this is, I feel like, the startup scientific method, right? Like, you have like this problem, you come up with this hypothesis and you test it. Things that work, you take ahead and replicate, right? This is the startup scientific method. And I think the second greatest parallel that you can draw is sort of from a completely different, like, perspective. It's talent, right? How you approach talent is actually the exact same, right? I've been in a position of hiring in Web2. I've been in a position of hiring in Web3, right? I myself have been sort of the person who's been hired. I myself have also hired people, right? So talent you approach the same way. And what is that approach? Like, do people care enough? Do people care enough about what the thing that they're applying for, that they're building? Does that have some impact in their life? Do they have the skills that match it? If not, can we build for those skills? All right, can we solve for those skills? Right. The more fringe the technology, right? Like for example, Web3, the more fringe, the more you'd optimize for potential, right? Because there's just not as many people. But that is like a time related problem, right? Like over time, you're just going to have talent that just exists because, ideally the market would have grown, right? Like the idea would have grown. So even how you approach talent is like very, very, very similar. Now I talked about like sort of the parallels, and we'll talk about skills, right? Like when we talk about skills, I think so I'm going to talk from a non-technical perspective, right? Because that's just what my experience was. I think the most important one was just like, number one, I'm going to sound like an absolute cliche. People are probably going to hate me for this, but it's really communication, right? Like part of actually being really successful in Web3 is actually, can you read that white paper and make sense of it, right? Can you read a document and make sense of it? If you can make sense of it, can you then articulate it in the sense that like, tum likh sakte ho, or you can talk about it. Like you can either write about it or you can talk about it, right? Because then you're demystifying something difficult for a large group of people that have no idea what this stuff is, right? Because that's when like all of these like that's where the content creator boom comes from, right? Like where you have these influencers that are trying to like talk to you about various protocols and why does one consensus mechanism matter, or why, etc. Right? So the number one is communication, right? And subsets of that is being able to write or to speak, and that's just sort of universal. Two is like really really research, right? Like, can you be disciplined enough to like go deeper than just like what is given to you on a website or a blog, right? I think like research is probably the best thing you can do if you're just starting out. And there's multiple parts of it. Like I think reading is a small part of it. Sitting with someone who's already been through all of like the information is so much quicker, right? Like, you can just literally sit on LinkedIn, say, I'm a student, like I'm trying to learn. I love what you're building. Do you have maybe 20 minutes, right? 20 minutes in the week maximum. I promise I won't take more time than that. I just want to ask you a couple of questions and genuinely have really good questions. It's not that hard, right? If they're building an NFT company, don't ask them what their roadmap is. That's on their website. Ask them why their roadmap is like that, right? Why have they curated the community a certain? Why did they do a drop a certain way? Like ask those like sort of questions that even they'll want to speak with you. Right? Like no one wants to speak with people that have like no good questions to ask, right? So that is part of research, right? The reading condense part, you have to keep learning, right? Like that's the other thing. I think post research, another thing you can sort of do is like if you're an artist, like and you genuinely just are interested in design, now is a great time to sort of brush up on those skills because you are in desperate need, right? The tech will keep getting built. There's going to be plenty of people that want to communicate it, but like the design language is something that's really important because how we're going to communicate with this technology is still yet to be determined, right? Like with Web 2, right? Like we had a lot of things became standardized, and that's can be a good or a bad thing. It's a different conversation for a different time. But there were so many resources that were built into just like the design aspects, right? Like how do you want a certain thing to look so that it communicates, right? Or what are some creatives that we can use? What are some like what is the language that we can use within our design, right? So how do we build our design system? That really was powerful, right? So if you're a designer, like congratulations, you're in a golden era, right? Like this is the golden age. And if you're an artist in general, I think. So these are some of the others, like these are some of the over-the-top skills that I can think of on top of my head. And I think I can't remember what was the final aspect of the question that you had asked. There was like a third part.
The mindset,
The mindset. Okay. I think it's the same, right? Like across the board, assume you know nothing. Like I genuinely, I really stick by that. Like, I think it's easy to like sit up there, like read a bunch of stuff and like just tell you what I think I tell you, and then people will believe you if you're convincing enough. But I genuinely believe like continue, like just assume you know nothing, because if you're in a field like Web3, there's something new that comes up on like an hourly basis, right? And you are never going to be caught up, right? Like really, you're never going to be caught up, and make peace with that. Like don't be frustrated, make peace with that. You can't be perfect. the mindset should be like, you just constantly learn, right? Speak to people, be humble, like, even if you're like a multi-billion-dollar founder, right? Like if any of you, decide to like become multi-billion-dollar founders, just continue being nice and sweet and humble. It really helps other people trying to get to your position. So like because I've had some great conversations with some really, really smart people, right? And they have been kind enough to open up their minds, right? Where they tell you like, this is why I think a certain way. This is why I do a certain thing. This is what you should check out. You would be good for this. You unlock these sort of like little bits of wisdom, the more receptive you are to information. That's really the only thing you need to do. I would say like an addendum to that is like sort of, if you're going to be humble and if you're willing to learn, like constantly put an effort, right? Like don't like result will come eventually, right? I honestly believe that. It might be like an optimistic thing. But I think like, if you're sort of going to be able to, like, if you're absorbing so much knowledge, you're condensing it into like actionable information, insights, you're trying to do your best to help out other people, you're building a network, you're sort of willing, like sort of, something or the other will come eventually, because you're just sort of working through the whole system of being part of the ecosystem, right? And one of the people that, if you don't believe me, you should believe Naval Ravikant, right? Like he's mentioned this in his book, right? There are like only a couple types of way you can sort of make success happen. One, be born into it. That's the easy one. Number two, just, and it's literally written in his book, Almanac of Ravikant, right? So he just says, you just stir stuff up so much that success happens, just happens, right? I really like that idea. And the third, I think, is more important, is that you leverage different types of things, whether that be knowledge, whether that be capital, whether that be your own like skills. Leverage those like sort of like aspects. So I would say like that would be like sort of a conclusion.
Super awesome. I mean, this, I think, turning to be one of the best webinar that we did so far. So much of information and so much of packed knowledge there. I myself am taking ton of notes, guys. I'll put everything in the Notion and we'll share it along with the recording.
You're too nice, Kiran. Yeah, I think that's the problem.
No. Like you're actually talking what is required, and the way how you are actually bucketizing that, and then giving each actionable points is super valuable to the audience there. So yeah, let's talk about the higher level aspect, right? Rishi, we when we discussed, I think we said there are multiple aspects that people can start building career in Web3. One is marketing, operations, growth, and then content, right? And I think we briefly touched on content. Research, start writing, start putting out there, associated with people, go talk to them, ask intelligent questions, and then again, start recording that stuff, right? And might take their permission and then say, hey, can I share it with the audience? I think the more content and the valuable content, right? That someone writes, that's how they grow, and I think that will open a lot of opportunities for them as well. So we touched on growth and operations. So how about on the marketing side per se, right? Sure. A little on the marketing. So my question here is, so over the last couple of months, what has happened in Web3 is, the super crazy stuff, right? I think all of a sudden people said, okay, there is an airdrop, NFTs, mint. I think people were just going crazy and people were just hopping around in the anticipation that they will get an airdrops, they like to be part of the initial cohort, where they get some freebies or whatever stuff, right? But if you see now, like most of the NFT projects have failed, and there are only very few successful ones. Because the underlying logic of these NFT projects is there is no value add, it is just some sort of hype and people got carried away, right?
Sure.
So when we talk about the traditional marketing, obviously we have the funnels, and we're going to keep focusing on. I mean, there is search engine optimizations, there's a lot of Facebook ads, Google ads, whatnot. There's a whole set of stuff that people do in the world, right? So when it comes to Web3 world, how does the marketing aspect look as of today, right? And how do you see the marketing shape up in the next, say, we can't talk about 5 years, but say in the next 5 to 18 months. Yeah,
Sure.
yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like in the next 12 to 18 months before maybe we hit the next bull run. And again, like if someone who is looking to make a career in marketing, especially in the Web3 world, what sort of stuff and what sort of qualities that they need to, skill set and the qualities that they should, try to imbibe and learn at the moment.
Sure. Okay, great. I think what I'll do is I'll give you two approaches, right? There's like in my head, I think I have two approaches. And I'm not going to talk about like the marketing part. It'll sort of relate. I think the two approaches, one, I'll go with the second approach, right? The second approach is of one who already has a skill, right? Like who has some skill, right? Whether that be content writing. And when we talk about marketing, if you're good at technical SEO or SEO writing or, building good landing pages, working through Google Analytics, let's say you have some sort of skill. Okay. The first thing you need to do is actually become like sort of Web3 knowledgeable. Step one, right? If you have some sort of skill that you can work at different startups, get the knowledge, right? So, you can like get like whether that be about different, like, and there's actually a way of learning about Web3 as well, right? So Kiran mentioned, like the document that I wrote, I actually broke it down into buckets, right? There's protocols, there's DAOs, there's NFTs, and it's not complete. Like it's not a conclusive document. But the idea is that, start somewhere. If you're going to start somewhere, I would actually recommend go protocol level, right? Do the hardest part, right? Like learn the hardest part, which I think is protocols, because when you understand protocols, you understand the philosophy behind like how Web3 is shaping up to be, because then you'll understand consensus mechanism, you'll understand token economics, you'll understand why that protocol is even required, you'll understand how it sort of is going to like, what demographic is it going to resonate with. So it shapes your brain up really well. Then like sort of the other things like bleed into it, right? And learning about NFTs will be easier. DeFi will still be a little more sort of challenging, but you'll be able to get through it, right? So learn about Web3 step 2. Once you actually are Web3 knowledgeable, that already puts you at like an elite percentage of talent, right? Because there's a big difference between Web3 curious and Web3 knowledgeable, right? There are plenty of people that are Web3 curious, right? There are plenty of people that are Web3 curious, and there's only going to be more people that are Web3 curious. Just being really blunt with you, no one cares about Web3 curious, right? Unless you're giving a service or like what you're working on, right? Like Kiran, you care about people who are Web3 curious because your idea is to become like Web3 knowledgeable, right? Companies who are building different products really don't care if you're Web3 curious, unless you're like exceptional at some skill, and then like, they'll figure out how to teach you stuff. If that's you, then you're good. You don't need to be here anymore, right? So then you sort of like, once you're Web3 knowledgeable, then you start, when you apply to opportunities, you can eventually draft a pitch, right? I like your company because XYZ, right? This is what I, once you say what I've liked about your company, you can give some context about yourself. I am XYZ who has worked on XYZ, right? And it's pure proof of work, right? Like if you can show people ki maine ye kiya hai, whatever it is, simple, right? Like it'll resonate. People will understand. Acha, isko pata hai. Then let's get this conversation going. Easy pitch. Ideally, you do this multiple times. Ideally, you convert. That's just and then the normal hiring process for anything follows, right? Like just because you're Web3 knowledgeable and you have a skill doesn't mean you'll get hired. Like that's just the way things are. I don't know why it is, but just bear with me. Okay. Now the first approach. You have no clue what you're doing. You have no clue where to start. You like just break down different things into bite-sized chunks. Now you can start in two places. One, you can start at the Web3 end, break it down into one idea that you want to go into, right? Whether that be protocol level, NFT level, again, you can decide. Once you get into that, you can start seeing things that interest you, right? That may give you ideas of like, okay, maybe I want to help out here. Then you can figure out what's a skill that's going to make me effective in helping out in this one idea. Then you can search for companies that are working on that idea. There you have a funnel. Other approach. You have a skill. Let's say you're good at sales, right? You're fantastic at sales. You figure out, okay, you go through the process of learning about Web3. This is the different things that are there. What can I like when I learn about sales? How can I apply it, right? and there's going to be multiple, there's community managers, there's like sort of like customer sales representatives, like there's like in the sense of like account managers for different funds, and you can speak to different people. Just get started, honestly, right? Like once you get started, then you can figure out your way of what you're good at, right? Like the idea is to get started somewhere, right? So making this full circle, right? Like really going back into like, how is this going to apply to like marketing or growth or whatever it is? Like figure out where you stand in the sort of in the journey, right? Like if you have no idea where you are, figure out what you are either good at or what about Web3 that interests you. Then go through the process. If you already have a skill, you don't know about Web3 or you already know about Web3, figure out what companies are working on a space that you are genuinely interested in. Don't just start applying for jobs, because I've taken interviews on like who have just applied for jobs. The number one thing is like, oh, I just like Web3. I think it's going to be the future. My immediate question is a one-word answer. Why? And that's where the interview ends, right? Because I know the person is not taking the time to research. I know the person has like seen some Times of India article saying ki crypto ye hai. That's it. That's cool. Like, okay, you're starting somewhere, but that's not like we're not some flashy like companies, right? Like we run on tight budgets, wanting to sort of, and supremely ambitious individuals, right? So thoda bahut, like you have to be, sort of wary of your funds and how you allocate them, and eventually like go through the whole process of hiring. So I can't just possibly hire everyone and anyone I like, right? So be mindful of that. Yeah, I think that this breaking it down into these steps makes your life a lot easier, right? Because then it doesn't feel like he would say like, where do I even start, right? So it becomes a lot smoother for you.
Oh man, this is again a true wealth of information there. Two templates for people, and I 100% agree, right? And I think the first thing is, I think there has been like a lot of companies out there, who were trying to promote what Web3 is all about. There are like a lot of Web3 enthusiasts. 100% agree there. Which is good in one way, because at least people started to understand what or hear the term what Web3 is all about. Whether they understand what this is about or not, that's a different issue. Yeah, Web3 knowledgeable, and I think I would like to add one more small point to that, right? Applications of knowledge to the company that you are applying for as well. Right? That is also very important. Someone should be able to articulate. Okay, now I know what is taking and yielding is all about. Like here is how. Here is what your company is doing. Here is where I can come and help. Because of the knowledge that I have. Right. Similar to that, like, hey, I know what an NFT minting process is. So I have seen some of the best practices in the NFT minting process. Might be this is what you're doing. This is where I can come and help you. So that's the real value addition that someone can give to the company, and I think it should start not even at the interview level. It should start whenever they are approaching, either via cold emails or LinkedIn requests, etc., and all that. I always say this, and in fact, like I have seen success on a personal note in my career as well. Right? Whenever I apply for a job or whenever I used to apply, it always used to follow with some sort of a small assignment. With that, research about a company. Hey, here is what I could do. Might be, in fact, like when I was working in private equity there back in New York, right? My whole application used to be like, okay, hey, here is your 30, 60, 90 day plan. Here is what I'm going to achieve for you.
Perfect.
And people and like send it with a short assignment, whether put it in Google Drive or whatever, the docs, etc. and all. And people used to appreciate it. Whether I got the job at a later stage or not, that's a different issue, right? But I was able to turn that into like multiple interviews, for on the table. Anyway, so completely related to what you said there. I think we have one question, and it's a basic question. So speaking of content, right? And I think for beginners, so Skandesh is asking, do you recommend writing out what we understood, or does it cause any sort of misinformation? If they start writing.
That's honestly a very good question. Because I will agree. Like not all information is good information. You're right. So I think I think what really works well is being able to have like a small, like sort of, this might be hard to do, but having a tester group, right? Like where you are reaching out to people. I would say like probably reach out to people who are willing to sort of help you out with the process. Then maybe when you're writing content or like going through some of these ideas, you can get a sort of reference from them. That's one way of sort of going about, figuring out like what is the right type of content. Two is, I think the second type of, approach is what most people do is just sort of start writing and see what sticks. Right. That's what most people do, right? Like they'll figure out like, okay, and what sticks doesn't necessarily mean what is right, right? Like this whole term called FUD was invented, right? Like where, you're giving information, but it's actually like, it's fear, uncertainty, and doubt, right? So I would say just generally research process, right? Like if you're going to be able to thoroughly research, I think a piece of content is solid if you can actually provide sources that can be verifiable and make a point, right? Like it's not just like information, right? Like I think you'll tend to do well as a content writer if you can distill information and stick in your opinion as well, right? Because that's really what people are coming to read, not otherwise like the news people will just do what you're going to do and they have 200 times your distribution. And that goes for me as well, right? Like I may have a brand new piece of news, but like CoinDesk will blow me out of the water any day. So that's probably, I don't know if that answers your question. I hope it does.
Yeah. So I think I would add like 2 points. So this is what I have seen my curve initially, like when you are starting to write content. Right? There are two thought processes that you can actually apply to, right? So start with the existing content that are out there in the market. Like for example, like you can start reading Bitcoin white paper or Ethereum white paper. I'm just throwing some examples, or something like a Uniswap white paper or a D/Dx white paper there, right? And then might be distill that information into digestible format and digestible content, and then start putting out there. So when you start doing that, it's not you are actually digesting that content and you are putting it in a readable format to the user, and the chances of misinformation are negligible there. Okay, unless like you reinvent the whole wheel and then change the algorithm or the tokenomics of Uniswap or DBDX there,
which would be awesome. I mean, just which would be awesome. Like
yeah, so that's like one way to start with. Start doing that digestible stuff. Once you start doing that, might be right about 10, 15, 20, 25 articles, then you will be able to understand the ecosystem better, from the content perspective. Okay, hey, now I'm like I have deep dived into the DeFi ecosystem. I think there are some issues here. I think there is an issue with the liquidity. Why is liquidity is a problem on a DeFi space? Why are the users hopping from one platform to another platform? So why is this platform giving high APY, etc. Right? Then over a period of time, when I mean over a period of time, like once you write the 15, 20 articles, then you should be able to frame your own opinion about what is going on in the ecosystem, right? And to Rishi's point, then start writing articles or form your opinions and start putting some content and send it to the beta testers or beta users. Might be your close group of friends, or might be again previously to Rishi's point, like reach out to someone on LinkedIn and then say, hey, you know what? I think you are operating in the DeFi space. Really love your work. Hey, by the way, like I have written this piece of content, on this particular XYZ topic. Would you like to take a look and give me a feedback? Right? Would really appreciate it. So that way, like you are reaching out to experts and validating what you have written is correct or wrong. Then if they say, okay, hey, Jude, this is awesome, go ahead and post it. It's as simple as that. Okay, I think that could be some sort of a gradual process. If you're scared that okay, hey, whatever I'm putting would be construed as misinformation and people might bash at me or come back at me,
yeah,
we can take this sort of an approach there as
well. Yeah. And just one thing, just in general, in like sort of if you're a writer and if you're in Web3, like if you're going to make a great point that's going to be met with a lot of positive positive feedback from the community, you're going to get a substantially larger amount of negative feedback from the community, right? That is just, you have to accept that. That is just how things are. It's based on the platform. And that, like, I'm sure, like, there's a couple of people on Twitter that I, follow religiously, right? Like, about DeFi, right? I'm sure, Kiran, like the DeFi Edge, like this guy, like, distills down everything. I think he does a fantastic job. But I'm sure there's like equally amount of people that are like, an idiot, like, is barely researched, like, where are your sources? You have no idea how DeFi works. And these are people that have like probably like a fake account with an avatar or whatever, they're just like hiding behind something. And stand by your opinion if you genuinely believe it, right? Like, it's really as simple as, like, literally all blockchain systems, right? Like, it's out there and it's verifiable and it'll be linked back to you, whatever your identity may be, right? Don't throw out something that you don't believe in, because you're probably going to get roasted, right? Like, I personally wouldn't like to get roasted, but sometimes it happens, right? Like, sometimes you will get roasted. So I would say, like, just be wary of that, because that's just what the ecosystem is like now. And the other thing is, like, no question is stupid. I feel like people told you this, like, in your like kindergarten experiences. I don't know why people forget this in their adult life. No question is stupid, right? Like, it's brand new fringe technology, right? Like, if there was an absolute expert on something, like, that person would be like the ruler of the planet, right? Like, but there isn't a ruler of the planet. So far we're all figuring stuff out. Ask like really good questions and someone will answer it if they have an answer. If not, go search for it yourself. So that's what I would probably say from a content perspective.
Absolutely. So we'll take one more question and do like closing remarks, Rishi. So Rahul is asking, from the company's perspective, I think from the Web3 company perspective, right? Where should the focus be? Whether building products for the Web3 knowledgeable users, or making the Web3 curious people knowledgeable, expanding the user base. I think it depends on the company that you will be operating, the idea that you are working on. But I think I'll let you take the content.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think that's just as good a question as anything else. I'd agree with you, Kiran. I mean, like, it really depends on the product, but in general, I would say for an idea to stick, you're going to have to find a user base that cares about it, right? Like I mentioned before. Once that sort of happens, you build this cycle of like, you essentially build optimization that's going to prove that this solution exists to a problem. What ends up happening is that, like, you end up getting different sort of things. Like, you end up doing marketing, you end up having champion users, you end up having just assets that you share. That propagates itself across, because the internet is not a black hole. Right. So what ends up happening is that it sort of like, gets people in however they may be, whether that's Web3 curious people who will then eventually go through the cycle of learning, which is why when you're building, think about how you're creating resources as well. Right. Because then you're going to be able to generate assets that people are going to like sort of learn about and then eventually come to you as a like matured individual. If it's sort of Web3 knowledgeable people, like, ideally, if you're a company that's building like core technology, right? Like, it's most likely going to start with like a really small bunch of people, and they're most likely going to be people that like know the most about the tech as a whole. And I can give you like real world examples, which I think will really help you out with this. Let's talk about exchanges. There are hundreds of millions of users of exchanges. I will guarantee you maybe 2% are crypto native people. I guarantee it, right? Like, I guarantee that people across WazirX, CoinDCX, Coinbase, whatever you name it, right? The people, like, the maybe 5% of people actually know what they're putting their money into, to be very honest with you. But the exchanges onboarded a bunch of people into crypto that we never imagined. Why? Because the network effects were as such ki paisa ban raha hai, right? So people got in. You never imagined this to happen, right? But it sort of happened, right? You built a core product to solve a problem for a set of people, right? And that sort of propagated itself. Now let's talk about something completely opposite. Let's say you're building a protocol. Let's say you are the founder of, I'm not going to say Ethereum because that's a very complex question. Let's say you're Solana, right? Let's say you're Solana, you're building Solana. You started out like trying to take on existing protocols, right? You're trying to like sort of build a protocol that's built for the highest amount of throughput. That's the idea, right? Eventually what ends up happening is you get a bunch of core people that believe in the project. Then you have a bunch of use cases built on top of the product, which is by crypto native people. Then you're sort of having this like NFT explosion. Now you're building a phone. Now you're building XYZ, right? Like now you're bringing in the rest because now people know what Solana is, right? Like, oh, acha, ye aisa hai. They do XYZ and they don't need to care about what your consensus protocol is, how your token economics works. They just care ki, okay, it's a token, is going to let me do XYZ, right? So you have two completely different spectrums of things. So that is how you would, probably prioritize. Oh, I just saw this other question. Yeah.
So
awesome.
How did Cypher got started promoting its product or building?
Yeah. So Cypher's co-founders, they both were in college. I think they both were in college together, building sort of a solution, for. I think they themselves were like trading cryptocurrencies and had lost money because of sort of seed phrase issues, right? This is a personal problem, right? So it stemmed from a personal problem, and like when you validate it, it's actually like quite true. Like people, it's very difficult to imagine that. Okay, how should I give an example? Okay, let's say your entire net worth, right? I asked you to write a backup of that on a piece of paper, and let's say you're moving houses and you lost that piece of paper. What do? That's what crypto is like right now. That's the exact representation of what your wallet is like right now, right? You can have $20, you can have $20 billion. That piece of paper has a backup for your entire crypto holdings, and if that's gone, you're pretty screwed, right? So this was like a problem where like, okay, how do we sort of mitigate this problem? And then eventually, this like sort of the exploration of technology, and then eventually coming up with the solution, and then being able to distill it down into something that people can actually use. So I would say, and the second part is promoting its product of building. Could you like sort of elaborate on what that second section sort of means? Like,
so I think if I understood correctly, so they were like, so how did you position it as, so did you position it as a product or,
Yeah, I think positioning wise, there is like a clear like market leader, right? Like Ledger is like the #1 sort of hardware wallet on earth, right? And it's by like a margin, right? Like there's like a lot of people that use it. We can have like a discussion about like sort of cryptocurrency native wallets. Like for example, if you're a Bitcoin holder, one of the major wallets you're going to hear about is Cold Card, right? So otherwise, I guess if you're not, Ledger is very popular. So we sort of positioned ourselves in the sense that, we already assume that, or we know that people have, it's going to be individuals that already are within the crypto ecosystem, #1, right? Because it's sort of easier, like explaining this problem becomes a lot easier when you yourself like empathize with it, right? So let's say Kiran, or let's say myself, like, let's say we have 3 different wallets, we have 3 different seed phrases, right? We need to have 3 different backups of these seed phrases. So when I tell you, you don't need to do this one step that's actually causing you a lot of pain. It makes it a lot simpler, right? Like it makes life a lot simpler, and the pitch is easier. So you sort of get this like one sort of group of people to start using this product, and actually saying that, okay, testing out the chicks, does it work? Can I trust it? Like from a technology perspective, not on the company perspective. I shouldn't have to trust. You should have to trust me as a person for the product to work, right? The product should do it for itself. And then eventually, right, like when we're able to, like when we know that this is a security solution that 100% works, it's been pressure tested. That's sort of when you can go out and start onboarding sort of these like sort of early like fringe type of people, right? Like who are just on exchanges, have smaller holdings, are interested in Web3. Then that's sort of like, that growth process propagates itself.
Cool. Super. Okay, I think this is the the lengthiest webinar I think we did. I hope so. That's almost we are touching the 1 hour mark. So thank you so much, Rishi. I'll let you have some final remarks, and we can
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
I mean, firstly, like I really enjoyed speaking with Kiran. Really happy that we got to connect, and glad that I could share a little bit about why I find crypto a little interesting. But in the learning process, like I understand like reaching out to people on LinkedIn and like trying to get people to convert. It's a tough process. Like you may not know how to pitch yourself. You may not understand that how should I approach people. To that, I would say like I'm on your Discord channel, so you can message me at any point of time. I'm happy to help anyone, like if you're sort of figuring stuff out, because I know how painful the process is, right? So I can understand. And two, I would say like when you're sort of exploring, well, it may be crypto today, it could be something else tomorrow. I would say really think about two things. One is how nuanced can you get, like how deep can you get in terms of like just general knowledge, and two, can you have conviction and a thesis, right? Now what do those two things mean is that do you believe that this is going to, like, this technology is going to solve XYZ problem, and the thesis part, that's the conviction part, and the thesis part is this is how I think it's going to play out. If you're confident enough to say that this is how I think it's going to play out, and you can pressure test that concept, with your discussions, I think you're in a really good place. Like I would feel pretty confident in my knowledge about crypto as a whole. So yeah, and feel free to message me. Always happy to chat. Yeah, thank you again for having me, Kiran. Really appreciate it.
No, thank you so much, Rishi. As I said, I think took lots and lots of notes, and I must have learned a lot. And I think the way how you distill that information, is super crystal clear, and interestingly, we did not even have a single drop, by the way. So people are super glued to it. That itself speaks, right? And already people are saying thank you and all. So thank you so much for your time, man. And love to keep the conversation going, and also would love to keep even learning from you. I'm sure the growth and marketing, there are multiple strategies that will come up in the Web3 world, and it will keep evolving, as we go along. Would love to revisit the conversation on a regular basis, catch up, and have those conversations.
Full disclosure, even I'm like learning a bunch of stuff, right? Like I don't have it all figured out. So whatever I figure out, I'll be happy to share. So
super. Okay, thanks guys. Have a great evening. Thanks for joining. So as I said, we will share the recording and the notes very soon. And thanks so much, Rishi. Have a great evening, guys.
Bye bye.
Cheers. Bye.